We're going to go on this afternoon to discuss the present, which is the whole debate around big data.
If you look back over the corporate scandals over the last 10, 20 years, when you do your root cause analysis, it comes down to culture. We've got to help companies work out how do they build this positivity into their organisational purpose, their own data ethics.
It's personal information supplied by people that has pumped billions and billions of dollars and pounds into the Googles, Facebooks, Amazons and many other giants of the digital economy.
The fall from grace that we have seen of politicians and the financial services will be as nothing in comparison to the catastrophic loss of trust which will follow this data chaos.
Data can start to make our very thoughts visible. How do we deal with the politics of data? How do we make sure that these automated systems facilitate to build a world that we want?
If you have a question as opposed to a comment, we're happy to accept observation. Right, there's definitely one at the very back there.
Hello, hi. So my name is Vivian Parry, and what I really want the panel's opinion on is why people can't be trusted to hold their own data. So for health data, the only time that the health service allows you to hold your own data is when you have hormones rushing through you during pregnancy and you can't even remember the day. And yet, that's the only time you're allowed to hold data. And actually, if patients hold data, they can self-correct. And I know a lot of people worry about too many corrections. But isn't it all about somehow that lack of trust, that we don't actually trust consumers to hold their own data? Or am I missing the point?
Thank you. We'll take the... where was it? You up there? Yes, take that one next.
Mark Mazin, UCL.
Was it you rather than the lady?
Yes.
Yes, sorry, yes.
Okay.
It's my arm, her face.
Double act. It worked.
Which many people would say is an improvement. So I'm happy with that. Can I ask, why don't companies understand the amount of data out there? For example, I work with big data, I look at the green economy, and I'm looking around, and any of you that own companies or work for companies, I have all the transactional data for the last 4 years of everything you've ever done as a company. Okay? And I can find it from about 100 different sources, so I can actually correlate it and make sure that I understand what you actually spent. You think it's secret. It isn't. Why do companies not understand that everything that they do is out there and we can find it?
Okay. And is there another one on this side already? Yes, can I take the one in the middle and then we'll get some thoughts from the panel on these three.
Hello there, my name is Natasha Salem and I'm one of the heads of technology at Sky. I guess a question to the panel, what more can business and government be doing to encourage the next generation to get involved in cybersecurity? Because ultimately, we're in a society now with IoT, with social media, where we're gathering so much more data, and cybersecurity is an ever-evolving threat, and we are simply not getting the pipeline of talent into the industry.
Thank you. Can we deal, I thought maybe Richard first, on the first issue that was raised, which is why aren't people trusted more to hold their own data, and gave the example of the NHS in particular. What's your understanding on this?
I have a certain sympathy with that. We dealt 10 years ago now with the then government's attempt to bring in a comprehensive top-down electronic health data system. And it wasn't working, and it was fairly clear to us it wasn't going to work. We saw all sorts of risks with it. And we did actually commission a piece of work as to why couldn't people simply walk around, patients walk around with their own data, and almost envisaging a sort of a wristwatch where everything is there, you go into the doctor, you go to the hospital, it's there. I think one day something along those lines may come, but that's within the context of a national health service. I think it's much more difficult as citizens and as consumers, where organisations, you share your data with them, they need it for all sorts of purposes. I don't quite see how that could easily work where everything was within yourself. But having said all that, one of the fundamental principles of data protection is your legal right to see your own data, to ensure it's accurate and to insist upon it being corrected. So I think that is a halfway house to what's being proposed.
Chi.
Well, my answer to that would be yes, we can and we should, and that is the failing, the huge failing in the current data environment. So citizens, consumers should have control and ownership of their own data. Now, that doesn't, and I agree, shouldn't mean that they're carrying it around on USB drives for many different reasons. And it's true also that we don't have the technical and I would also say regulatory infrastructure in place to make that possible. But there are third parties such as MyDex and others who are looking at ways of making sure that consumers can have the data that they choose to have in a certain place and have complete control over it. And I think that the fundamental principle, the absolute principle which we haven't recognised, that consumers and citizens own and control their own data, would be the basis for enabling more trust and autonomy by citizens, and also an ecosystem, I hate that word, but there we are, of innovative solutions to enable that trust to be, and ownership to be a reality. And just on the sort of on the Internet of Things, with the lady from Sky raised, so we have a certain level of data. I agree, there's a huge amount of data out there. The Internet of Things, I mean, I don't like to use the word exponential because so many politicians use it in its non-mathematical sense. But here, this is truly an exponential increase in the amount of data. And in that sense, it wouldn't be, practical again for consumers and citizens to have all the Internet of Things data, which is going to be flooding out of their homes and bodies, etc., over the next few years. But retaining ownership and control of it is and would and should be possible if we had the right regulatory framework.
Can I bring in both Ben and Azeem, widening it to the whole issue about cybersecurity and how far that's part of it, and this idea about actually how much data is already out there and there's a misunderstanding about what is held privately or not. Do you want to answer
sure,
those
I'll answer
yourself?
that, but if you don't mind, I'll just pick up that
Please
first
do,
question.
Absolutely.
3 questions in one gives us a bit of leeway.
Yeah.
On the kind of the role of self-governing identity, I think it comes back to the discussion we had before lunch around benefits. I think it's a very compelling idea that we'll all manage our own data. It would fix a number of problems around data quality, consistency, and there are a lot of startups pushing that out. I think where it becomes even more compelling then is where you've got this idea of mutual value exchange. There's 2 startups I'm aware of, Data Coop and Data Wallet, that are looking to, if you go onto Google and say, how do I sell my data, they tend to come up. You put your data on there, and then they sell your data for you and they maintain it. And if someone wants to subscribe to that data, then they're able to do so. So it's a bit of a halfway house. But I think that benefit question is quite important. What's the benefit to the customer of owning it over and above this issue around control?
Azeem.
Yeah. So on the question of cybersecurity, we live in a strange place where there'll be 60 billion connected devices on the Internet of Things network within about 7 years. But there's no real regulation around their security. So if I was a pharmaceutical company, I would have a set of regulations and a set of liabilities. And likewise, if I was a car company, I put out a car with bad brakes, there'd be some degree of liability. But if I buy a dodgy Internet of Things connected fridge that leads to some cyber attack in my home, it's not clear that the manufacturer will have any liability. And so I think there are some other areas of the law beyond sort of statute increasing investment in training to look at what is the responsibility of the manufacturers of these quite often very cheap devices.
Richard, yes, good. I mean, the question this all leads to is how much can government do? It seems to me there's so much potential, and yet there's so much concern about government being on the wrong side of it, and as with the NHS kind of database scandal, getting it wrong and throwing money.
Well, can I just start by saying a word about control? The traditional model of data protection is in some ways falling apart. It's based on notice and consent. You tell people what's happening, you get their consent, that's okay. PayPal's privacy policy is 36,275 words. Hamlet is Shakespeare's longest piece. That's 30,066. And yet we're making a nation of liars. I have read, no, accept and understand these terms and conditions. That is not a model for the future. In many ways, and I think there's some evidence to support this, people are more concerned increasingly about state-held data than commercial-held data. At least in the commercial marketplace, there's reputation, there's competition. When the state holds, I banged on about sleepwalking into a surveillance society, and some of that, I think, is happening in some respects now. Can I tell the bonking story?
Please. I've been waiting for it.
Okay, just very quickly. Little girl at school overheard in the playground by the dinner lady My dad bonked me last night. Head mistress involved, social services, police, charge in, found out the previous day the father had taken the girl to the playground, the local fun fair, had won a large inflatable hammer and had bonked her on the head. End of story. Except that 5 years later, the aunt of the little girl had a small problem with the police, and the police said, I see you come from a family of suspected sex offenders. It's on the police national computer. And
so
that's an example.
This is real?
Oh, yeah. That's an example, I think, of, people not taking care. All that data should have been updated, corrected, probably not held at all in the first place. But that's an example of how real damage can be done. Not necessarily monetary damage, but damage to families, individuals, relationships by inappropriate, wrong, inaccurate, out-of-date data.
Okay, very briefly, and then
just a point on that, the level of trust comparison between the private and the public sector. The last comprehensive study of this, which I know of, which was done by the Royal Society of Statistics, showed that in America, there's more concern about government than the private sector. In continental Europe, there's more concern about the private sector than government. And here in the UK, we're equally concerned about those.
Truth in that.
Interesting. Right, let's take some more questions. Right. Look, we've got two here, and then who's in the middle? Yes, there's a lady over there.
Juliet Morgan, British Land. I wonder whether there's a way to bring together or create some kind of correlation between carbon impact and what's going on with big data. There's a story in the last 2 days about the amount of carbon being emitted just from things like Bitcoin mining, and we seem to have these conversations in isolation, and there isn't this correlation about data and its impact on the planet.
Thank you. Right, and then there were two over here.
Chris Francis, SAP. At the moment, we have a whole series of things going on. The implementation of the GDPR, we have the privacy directive going through, we have the NIS directive being implemented. At the same time, we are having ethics committees being set up and funded. So where and how do we consider as a society, as politicians, as business, the boundary between regulation and that which must be complied with, and the more voluntary discussion around morality and ethics? And how do we deal with an ethics committee in public life?
And then there was a gentleman just behind you, I think. Or in front of you, sorry, yes, go ahead.
Hello, Peter Williamson, IT Director at Knights Brown Construction. My son will start school soon. Now, when I was his age, in order to protect my personal property, I knew at age 5 that all I had to do was have my name inside my PE kit. How is he going to be taught how to protect his personal data at that age?
Excellent questions. Right, we'll come to the lady there in a moment. But can I take the second one first, which is the boundary between regulation and kind of morality and ethics? And it seemed to me, Richard, when you talked about dumbing down the debate around big data, actually you were humanising it. You brought it down to the fact it was about people. And it seems to me that that is often lost. And I wondered if I don't know who wants to take it first. You want to go first, Azeem? This is the real concern about how much regulation should be doing and how much corporations are just, using our data for their own ends.
Well, I think corporations have a little bit of a problem because we're all still run from the basis of that September 1970 Milton Friedman column where he said the sole purpose of business is to make profits. And until, this is a point that sort of Ben made, that until businesses are in a position where they can start to think about the ethics rather than the short-term profitability, they have fiduciary duties. And even if the board agrees, I think they're probably worried about the odd activist shareholder that holds 4 or 5% and is enough to make trouble. So I think part of the bigger discussion that we will end up having, I think it's teed up at the beginning, is how do we go back and revise our understanding of what the purpose of business is? And the use and abuse of data is just one aspect of it.
Didn't Richard, you want to talk about this as well? And maybe also that issue about, with that generation of children who are just entering this world.
Well, I think data ethics is going to be the buzz phrase for the next 2 or 3 years. It's going to be the theme of next year's International Conference of all data commissioners worldwide.
The invites to that.
Well, yes, you can attend. It's going to be in Brussels. I think increasingly it's seen that data protection law has become far too detailed, far too prescriptive. I plead guilty to some of this. I said that the old directive was not fit for purpose and hope to see a simpler, more principle-based system emerging. Frankly, GDPR, what's coming out of Brussels now, coming to force this year, is very detailed, very complicated, a lawyer's dream, a citizen's nightmare in some respects. So I think I've said this already, implied, and I've said it time and time, as Commissioner, it's not just complying with the law. You can have technical breaches of a law which nobody would want to punish or deal with, but getting it right, justifying what you're doing. The one really good thing in the new regulation is the principle of accountability. Having good information governance in place and being accountable and held accountable for that, so you can stand up in any forum, whether before the regulator, before the media, before the public, and justify and explain what you're doing. That, I think, is a very sound principle, and that goes back, I think, to data ethics. In terms of preparing children, well, God help us. I mean, it's, you know, none of us can really see what's around the corner in this area. Perhaps EY have some ideas, but
yeah,
what's coming along.
I wondered if you wanted to talk about that.
I have to say it's tough enough training and educating the public as adults as to how to handle data. People are very careless with their data. They are worried about it falling into the wrong hands, and yet they surrender it and give it across to almost anybody without very much care. So educating children, preparing children, I suppose I just have to say be aware, and I think as we see more horror stories emerging, more and more people are going to be that much more cautious. But I haven't got a comprehensive answer, I'm afraid.
Ben, do you want to take that one? And indeed any other questions around
based on the research and the interviews we did, I'm pretty optimistic actually that GDPR will have a more profound effect than we might have previously thought. That it's not being seen just as a compliance exercise, that it is stimulating a bit of a rethink about data in the corporate world, but I think it will also raise awareness in consumers as well, and I think that will help with that question about the youngsters of today and tomorrow. But on the ethics point, I think it's you know, as I engaged with corporates on this ethics term, there was a bit of a recoil because there's a moralistic, and kind of immediately you're suggesting that there's an unethical intent. And I don't know many corporates that actually set out their corporate purpose to be unethical, but there will be potentially unethical practices down to people, exactly as you said earlier. And I think I'd love to figure out how we get beyond this term of data ethics, and maybe actually to your question, if I could steal the word sustainability, and it's, you know, is there something in this about sustainability and merging those two terms? In fact, there was a reasonable response in our study actually about corporates looking to build in the principles of good data ethics into the corporate social responsibility reporting, and that's quite an interesting, well, because that, you know, sustainability has been leading the way in terms of thinking about how do you value the you know, a sustainable supply chain, sustainable use of customer data, etc. So I think that might be something to think about as you go to your conference next year. How do we adapt the language to make it resonant with the corporate world as well?
And I'm really struck that so much the debate around this issue, certainly over the last few years, sort of presented these two sides, that there were, you know, government was trying to be over-controlling and regulatory, and that somehow the good guys, and that was certainly how the debate was being framed, you know, 3 or 4 years ago, the good guys were on the side of it all being open, and, you know, that somehow corporations were actually doing it for the benefit of us all. It feels like we've moved on from that considerably.
We have, which I think is a good move, but when I was at Ofcom, I mean, the idea was, or the sort of the ideal was a kind of Wild West where companies were all the good guys. And I remember saying to a room full of, as always it would be, male tech company executives that maybe government had a role to play in protecting consumers on the internet, and their faces sort of fell and they were prepared to walk out of the room at my excessive desire to control and protect consumers. So I think we have moved on, but we haven't moved on to a place where we have a fit-for-purpose regulatory framework. And I would say that the role of government is not to regulate every bit or byte, but it is certainly to set out a vision for what kind of society we want and what kind of rights citizens and consumers should have in it. And it's to set out some principles. And I'd go further and to say that, you know, I don't think we know those principles right now, and we need a debate to establish those principles. I think a principle should be that citizens own their own data, own and can control it. But let's have a debate about that. And then once we have the principles, then, you know, the moral and the ethical debate can go on within companies around that. With, at the same time, what we need is appropriate reporting so that when companies take decisions which we feel are not ethical, that is known. And just to the point that you made, so one of the things Labour has said is that we will consult on extending the duties of corporations beyond simply fiduciary and to also looking at duties to employees and potentially customers as well. Because I think that this is not simple, there's not one answer, but we need to look at many different policies which help update this entire, in some ways it's our entire corporate society for the 21st data century.
One of the approaches we
take...
Very
briefly, and then Azeem as well. No, go ahead, Richard.
Just briefly, I mean, we talk about a risk-based approach. Organisations tend to look at the risk to themselves. Will I get a massive fine under GDPR? Will I lose reputation, share value? But risks to the individuals, the customers, your staff, etc. If I can just quickly go from bonking to pregnancy. In the States, a supermarket analysed its customer data and said, we know which of our customers are pregnant. Sent them vouchers, 99% accurate, not 100%. People who said, my daughter's not pregnant, I'm impotent, things like that. Enormous scandals arose from that because they hadn't sat down and said, what are the risks getting this wrong?
They shouldn't have been able to do that.
No.
They shouldn't have been able to do that.
Just say something about GDPR, which I think is generally quite an exciting thing to have happened. But there are the two companies who are most well positioned to handle GDPR are Google and Facebook. And they are the ones, in particular Facebook's case, whose use of our data is the one that's most concerning. And even in a GDPR environment, I'm willing to take a bet on this, not many consumers are going to ask for Facebook to delete their data. And it's less, the risks from Facebook and its access to our data is less about my individual data, it's about the totality and the emergent properties that come out of the fact that it's got the data of 2.5 billion people and can build correlations over that. And so I think one of the things that is missing is a notion of a data commons, because really reality, none of us individually care that much about our data and the cost of our data, but in toto, it's extremely valuable, both positively and negatively, and I would like us to figure out how we get to a world of more and more of a data commons.
Thank you. Right, get the boom mic up. There was a person here.
Vinay Gupta from Ethereum, one of the blockchain companies. So I have a slightly contrarian take on this, which is I'm not sure the data is all that valuable. I mean, Facebook is making about £15 per person per year from the data they're gathering. Google's making about the same. They're making a lot of money because they're serving billions of people, but for each one of us individually, the data is not that valuable. We could easily have schemes where we simply buy our data back from these companies for, £30, £40, £50 a year, and that's the end of the use that they make of our data. Per individual, the amount of money involved is so small that we could, with the right set of market incentives, simply buy this stuff out from these guys within existing frameworks. The second thing is that there's a rational expectation that people have that consumers can manage their own data. But in practice, we don't manage our own water supplies, we don't manage our own electricity systems, and if we tried to have systems in which people manage their own data, in all probability, what they're going to do is simply pick somebody to manage it on their behalf, and those somebodies will become large and monopolistic in the way that these things tend to do, and will now simply have generated a legal consent framework under which people are now responsible for their own exploitation. There's no realistic way that we can expect people to manage this stuff. I'm a career technical professional. I can't figure out Facebook's privacy settings. I have no idea what's happening. And I think that's very typical. So I want to really challenge whether the companies are really in a position to do anything about this, or whether we should look at this as being a data commons that should be operated by the state, in the same way that the state handles water, handles environmental regulation, and so on.
Thank you. It's very thought-provoking. Right, there's one down here, near the very, very front, and at the very back, and then I think we've got two here. Right. It was the very front, wasn't it? I'm
Jeremy Watson. I'm director of the Petras Cybersecurity of the Internet of Things Hub, where we're doing research around those issues. And one of the things that concerns machine-to-machine communication, and I think also human-to-machine communication, is provenance and immutability. And I've not heard anyone concerned about that. So, okay, you can have my data, but what happens if you change my data to be misrepresentative? The bonking example, I suppose, is quite close. Is that a concern? How do we manage that? Can that be done through best practice or is regulation suggested?
Thank you. We've got two here. So there was one at the very back there, and I'm going to put that lady next, and I'll try and come to you.
Yes, hi. Okay, I'm Lauren Walker. I'm the Chief Data Officer for EMEA, for Dense Wages Network, which is a media agency, but I started my life in politics in the Clinton White House. And so for me, when I think about consumers and citizens today, they already do control part of their data, as has been stated, because people give it away as a value exchange to Facebook, to Google, and everything that they do. And so my concern, I suppose, is saying, who among us, all of us change agents in this room, I really feel like it's the schools, but who is helping everyone truly understand, maybe with the help of GDPR, at an individual level, what is the importance of data and what is our own role? As the gentleman said with his 5-year-old, how do we actually change society? Because I fundamentally see this as a societal thing. So I just very interested in your panel in terms of who really owns that responsibility, more than ethical, but like on an individual basis, what can we all do in our own roles?
And then there was the lady in the middle here. Can we bring down here? It's the third row.
I'm Helen Chesky. I'm a physicist at UCL, definitely speaking with my scientist hat on, which is something I spend a lot of time trying to convince my students of, is that just because you have measured a number doesn't mean it means anything. And there is the danger of all this big data. The difficulty has always been the interpretation. And so we're all talking about, numbers going into the system. I'm more concerned about what happens coming out, that you have a lot of numbers that the illusion of power that goes with apparent knowledge is amazing, but this is not quality controlled data. You don't know where it's come from, but the assumption is it's going to mean something, and there's potentially something very dangerous there in that decisions are being taken, policies are being made, and just because they're numbers doesn't mean they are worth anything. And what are the risks and challenges you see associated with that?
Thank you. So correct me if you think I'm wrong. This is how I've summed up the 3 questions, and you can take them anywhere you like. There's a question about provenance, about how our data might be being changed by people holding it, and then and what we can do about that and concerns about it. There's a question about the responsibility, where responsibility lies in trying to bring around some of the more humanised, responsible use of it that everyone here is talking about. And the third issue is the concern about the lack of quality control around how much of this data might be being used. You can take any of those that you want, but Ben, what do you want to...
Well, actually, I'm going to add another one, if you
Go
don't
on.
mind.
And yes, and also
which is Vinny's first
like
part
water?
1 of his question, which is about value. I think you're right, Vinny. I think to a large extent it's fairly benign kind of data usage. It's selling more stuff. We've just bought a pair of trainers and then bing, we've got another pair of trainers being marketed to us. But I think if you look at something like the automotive industry, McKinsey estimates that by 2030 it's going to be a $450 billion industry on data alone. Never mind the cars. I mean, GM, Ford and Tesla added up only get to about 120 billion. It's going to be, so you start to think about that. Neuroscientists are going to be interested in the behavioral data as we drive down the motorway. Insurers will be interested in it. All kinds of apps and services will be built around that. So that's, I think the estimates are about $40,000 you could get to with all of that data individually. Now, whether that's true or not, we'd have to play that out. But I think that's probably the first point. I think we're really only at the start of data value when you think about those kind of contexts. Okay.
Who wants to take on any of that or any of the others? So around provenance, around responsibility, and who has responsibility for trying to improve things, and on the quality control concern. Azeem first.
Building on Ben's point, I think when we look at data and we look at the risks of data, we are constantly worrying about the abuse of my credit card now that it's been stolen. It's sort of that kind of personal risk. But we have just established that there is this emergent societal risk to data abuse, and so the concern about the second pair of trainers and the third pair of trainers that you get shown chasing around the web is more about what happens in aggregate when those are our interactions with the world through the interfaces in which we see the world. What does that then teach us, let alone our kids, about what becomes important? What happens, what is a child who grows up in Las Vegas like compared to a child who grows up in the fjords of Norway, based on the influences that they get? And I think that is a question then about, do we want this data to be used for those sorts of sort of capitalism and manor ends, or for ends that take us towards a closer state of eudaimonia? Very briefly on the garbage in and the garbage out, I mean, we asked about what we should teach our 5-year-olds. I think we need to ask, what should we teach our 55-year-olds who are running our countries and running our companies? Data comes with confidence intervals. It's very distributional when it's coming out of machine learning systems and out of statistical analysis. And yet politicians and corporate leaders and the journalists who report on them need these point estimates. And there's a breakdown in the executive education, as it were, because you have a lot of people who, in my limited experience, wouldn't know their Gaussian from their T-stats, and they need to.
Thank you. Chi, and then Richard.
Yes, I'm going to start with the provenance and immutability, because it's an excellent question, and which I think I have an excellent answer. And one which enables me to use what my favorite phrase is now, because it is not data ethics, because I think we should have had data ethics 5 years ago. I think data ethics is, we need it, but it's reg tech, which is using technology for regulation. Yes, I know, it's a bit drier. Even dry, you could say, which is using technology for regulation. Because, many of the all this data which is being generated, we are also developing technology to control and track it. And so when you talk about provenance, I bought a mobile phone in '99, I think it is. It's been ported about 7 times. Every time somebody makes me a call to me, that is tracked. The technology to track and identify provenance, and indeed whether it changes, exists. What we need are the principles, and in terms of how we need to apply it. And that is why I say the principle of citizens owning and controlling. And owning and controlling is not the same as managing. People can own and control and not be obliged in any way to manage. The principle of citizens owning and controlling their data is the fundamental one, and I believe that we can develop the reg tech to make that a realistic proposal. I do want to say something about, because data is not the same as electricity or oil or water or any of the things that we compare it with. It's not really even the same as property. But so it may have small monetary value now, but you know what? I cannot pay Facebook to have Facebook without them using my data. So it's not an informed exchange, because I don't have any option. So what we need to do, again, so I'm beating on about this, is a regulatory framework which reflects what data is, which gives citizens control on it. I do really like the idea of data commons as well. We have public parks, we have common areas, and some in sort of the great assets of our country, we should have a data commons as well. But the first fundamental principle is owning and controlling of data.
Richard.
It is somewhat ironic that most of the points raised in these various questions actually are covered by the existing data protection principles. Using the data for the intended purpose, keeping it secure, keeping it up to date and so on. These have been there for 20, 30 years. What's been a real struggle is to get them taken seriously. When I was commissioner, we had no power whatsoever to impose any fines, take any sanctions. We bellyached. The Labour government gave it to us the week before I stood down after 7 years as commissioner. The UK commissioner now has a maximum fine of £500,000. It's going to go up under GDPR to 4% of global turnover. I don't think there's going to see millions and millions of pounds of fines imposed, but it is a wake-up call. And I think we are going to see these things being taken much more seriously. Almost everybody in this room now knows what GDPR stands for. A year ago, that wasn't the case. It is now, your survey brings us out, it's beginning now to go right up the corporate agenda. That's a good thing. That's where responsibility lies, I think, to actually make sure whether it's used ethically or correctly or just simply addressing and mitigating the risks to individuals. That is the way forward. It's not going to happen overnight, though.
Thank you. I know there was a gentleman on the end there, and then before we take one or two more, any others now? Coming to the end of the session. Boom mic down there. Is there one at the back there? Oh, over there, yes. Go ahead.
Sean Phelan, I'm a one-time data scientist, entrepreneur, and whatever. We've heard many, many examples of the bad sides of individual data points and about data in general, and almost nothing about the upside. And I just can't help thinking, I was wondering how many people in this room would sadly not be with us today if it wasn't for what had been achieved with big data over the last decade. The incredible success in preventing nasty terrorist incidents is almost entirely due to data. The fact that in a bad weather incident anywhere in the world, like 1% of the number of deaths happen that used to. It's entirely data analysis. I could go on. How many lives are we willing to lose or have dismembered or damaged in order to try and stick to our 19th century view of data security?
Nice contrarian view there. Let's have this comment here as well, yes.
Sophie Hackford, I'm a futurist. I just thought that the conversation, though fascinating, has been quite Western focused, and given that major population centres are not in this side of the world, but perhaps on the other side of the world, and have a very different understanding of surveillance technology, one country in particular. I'd just be interested to know how, if we think about China and other countries, how we'd also sort of, the internet doesn't respect jurisdictional boundaries often.
Thank you. So two very interesting issues there. One, we have focused very much on concerns and whether there is more to be said about the positive use of big data, but also this other issue, which is in the world our data exists in. There are much bigger issues around how countries like China are using it and how that might change things. So, I don't know, Ben, do you want to go first on this?
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I know you've said before that the centre of the universe is kind of in Shenzhen in China. I've heard you say that. So, and they have a very different view. It's a planned economy. They have a different attitude towards that, and they've got I'm sure many of you have seen the citizen score that they're planning on doing in certain cantons. It's and it's seen as that's serving the needs of the many, not the needs of the few. So I think, they have a completely different attitude to it, and it's an interesting point. What can we learn from that, if anything, rather than take a kind of moralistic or kind of relative view of it? I don't know.
Yes, Richard.
Well, I think the point about some of the benefits of big data is an important one. I've got some paper here I brought for today. Big data used in the States, one example, to reduce the number of hospital readmissions, looking at how many people left hospital, what characteristics identified such people to reduce the number of people going back into hospital. That was a great success. Another one where dropouts from schools, what factors actually drove people to drop out of school prematurely, and you can identify some of those factors and you can stop people dropping out of school prematurely. On the Asia question, there was this piece in the Times just 3 weeks ago about social scoring in China, using the same techniques as we use in this country for credit scoring, and giving people plus points for good social, good political behaviour, negative points for bad social, bad. I mean, that really is sleepwalking into a surveillance society. People will say that's China, but I mean, it just does show the power of data.
They're wide awake and they're walking.
Not always.
Yes, so I think it's absolutely right to bring in the point about how these, the centre, our population centres, and how the big data is being used, and its boundaries expanded in other countries. And but I think it's also true to say that data does respect boundaries, actually, because it has to flow across them. But we need to be aware of what is happening, and also, I think, to contribute in such global fora as we have, to making sure that they're more, that we're being part of that, if you like, global debate and global discussion. And I think, I was speaking to my head of, the chief fire officer on Friday. He was saying to me that 98%, I think he said, of all fires are due to either smoking, alcohol, drugs, or mental or physical disability. And if he had the data on that, he reckoned he could reduce fires, significantly, clearly. And I think, the potential of data, of big data, is absolutely huge. And as an engineer, I'm always like to get the opportunity to say that I believe engineers have saved more lives than doctors. But but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be regulated. And that the history, if you talk about the 19th or 18th century, the history is about regulating and setting out the legal framework for these great technological advances, be it the canals or the railways or electricity or data, in order that the most number of citizens possible can have the most benefit from them.
Do you mind if I pick up on that? Because that is, it does make me think about social division and the extent to which we will start to see the haves and have-nots as it relates to data, whether it's the value of data that you have yourself and your ability and literacy in terms of kind of monetizing that, or whether it's down to actually the data about you and actually propagating even more division and what you're entitled to. And I think that might be something to really keep an eye on. And it is indeed a role then. The regulation should be stepping in when it gets to that point.
I'm going to give you the last word, Azeem. I was just going to say on a positive thing, I'm one of those people signed up to the UK Biobank project where I have handed over my data and I know that they're going to monitor when I die and what of. But I kind of feel I'm part of a bigger project. Go ahead.
Wonderful. I couldn't do what I do without being an optimist. I mean, I think if you're pessimistic about the future and you're working in the future, it's a pretty scary place to be. So data has been tremendously valuable in 100, 1,000, a million ways. But the reason we need to be concerned about some of these things now is that we are turning the interfaces of our world into software code that talks to other software code that will learn from its data because it's machine learning. And once it gets in there, even if it's not de jure immutable, it'll be de facto immutable. So if we don't start now raising these questions and make sure we have the correct framework in place, we'll live in a world where the software and the machines that we interact with will believe that nurses can only ever be women. And I don't think that's the world that we want to live in. And because we are going to make these changes now, we have to sit at panels like this and have these discussions and hope that people go away and action it.
Thank you so much. I would say that the conversation we're having now feels already qualitatively so different to the conversation being had 5 or 10 years ago, particularly bringing in ethics into this. So thank you all very much.